All right, good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is John Dalmas. I'm the Director of the Michigan Chemistry Council, and welcome to this synthesis informative webinar titled 2021 Changes in the Air. Today's webinar is presented by our expert partners at Trinity Consultants, a consulting firm offering tremendous solutions for EHS, engineering, and science-related business needs. And in terms of EHS issues and where companies can expect the greatest pace of change, I think that air quality policy will certainly be at the forefront of those changes. Given the switchover in administration at the federal level especially, there have been and will continue to be numerous executive orders, revised and paused litigation positions, and new initiatives on climate and environmental justice that will impact air quality policies in the short term and for years to come. So we hope that this webinar, especially at this point in time, will help you better address these challenges. And we are very excited to have two expert presenters with us to share more, both from the federal and state perspectives. So first of all, we'll have Steve Zervis. He serves as a managing consultant in Trinity Consultants Ann Arbor, Michigan office. He has 30 years of experience in environmental, including industry, consulting, and as a regulator, and extensive experience in air quality, including permitting, regulatory interpretation and compliance, and strategic planning and training. Steve participates in several stakeholder groups, including the Michigan Chemistry Council and others in Michigan, helping him stay current on regulatory developments in the state. He's been a fount of knowledge for us on many issues in the past, works regularly with companies in the business of chemistry, and is very tied into all the developments at Eagle. Mike Grimsberg is a managing director with Trinity Consultants in their Washington, D.C. office. Mike has a BS in chemical engineering from the University of Maryland and has been an environmental compliance professional for more than 30 years. In addition to helping clients manage compliance risk and serving as a testifying expert on air pollution matters, he participates in a variety of national industry trade associations on behalf of Trinity, allowing him to keep a pulse on national environmental regulatory policy and rulemaking issues, especially out of the DC area. Mike also serves as an appointed member to the Maryland Climate Change Commission's Mitigation Work Group, something I know that we are looking at here in Michigan getting going soon, climate issues on behalf of our governor and the administration. So very grateful to have him here. They'll be able to look at both perspectives and offer that kind of broad look at where things are going, as well as specific issues here in the state of Michigan. They'll be first sharing some informative content, but would like to have some interactive Q&A following their presentation. So please use either the chat or Q&A features at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit those questions for us to review, and I'll be glad to moderate those at the end. So again, thank you very much, and I want to turn it over to Steve to take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, John. As John said, my name's Steve Zervis. I work here in Michigan out of the Ann Arbor office. By way of background, I have a BS in chemical engineering from Wayne State University. I've been doing air quality work since late 1987. I've spent 13 years with 2 different regulatory agencies, 20 years in industry and consulting, and I'm in my 5th year with leading Trinity's Ann Arbor office. My contact information is here on the slide. We did make handouts available to John. I think he can get you copies, or if you want to contact me, we can get you a copy of the handout if you're interested in copies of the slides. So by way of what to expect in Michigan, we're entering the 3rd year of Governor Whitmer's term, and so not a lot is new. Her direction and priorities were established early under various executive orders. To begin, she reorganized DEQ into Eagle. I was talking with somebody, one of our other Trinity offices in another state, about how many times DEQ has gone back and forth from DEQ to DNRE, back to DEQ, and now to Eagle. They got quite a kick out of that. So DEQ has become the Energy, Great Lakes, and Environment. They go by their acronym EGLE. I have it on the authority of unnamed sources within the department who say that their first choice for a name change would have been to rearrange these the name to Great Lakes Energy and the Environment, but the acronym runs into problems with copyright laws. Anyway, hopefully that didn't go over as poorly as I thought it might. But as I'm told often, I'm not funny. Every time I make a bad joke, I hear that. So the governor, again, is in her earliest executive orders, established the Office of the Clean Water Public Advocate, whose role is primarily involves dealing with drinking water issues, complaints, concerns raised by citizens or others, and helps work to mitigate those, connects people with the right organizations and the right agencies to make sure things get dealt with. Established the Office of the Great Lakes, who is working on restoration problems or restoration projects in areas of concern where there's been known environmental damage in Michigan. They have a coastline management protection program, coordinate efforts among different state agencies and with interstate partners and with international partners with Canada. And they develop and manage the Michigan Water Strategy, which surprisingly enough to me, being an air person, is quite the document. I thought I should get familiar with this, and then I saw how long it was and decided not to. Created the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team, who has been busy addressing PFAS issues in Michigan. They have helped to develop rulemaking for water discharge levels, air quality levels for PFAS contamination. And they continue to work in that area. Also, we have established the Office of Climate and Energy, Office of Environmental Justice, and I should have had these the other way, Environmental Justice Public Advocate, and the Interagency Environmental Justice Response Team. And I will talk a little more about those on the next slide. So the Office of Climate and Energy is tasked with developing the Michigan Healthy Climate Plan. The goal established by executive order is for Michigan to become carbon neutral by 2050. There is a goal by 2025 to achieve a 28% reduction below 2005 levels of greenhouse gas emissions. There is internal goals for state agencies, all state buildings to achieve a 40% reduction in energy use by 2040. All new state buildings or state buildings undergoing major renovations are to be carbon neutral by 2040. And the last piece of that is for the Treasury Department to establish an energy transition impact project to help communities deal with loss of employment, property tax revenues, community services that are related to a transition in energy use from traditional fuels to clean fuels. They are also tasked with developing tax and revenue strategies that coincide with issues relating to a change in the balance of fuel usages. So the Council on Climate Solutions is formed under the Office of Climate and Energy. They are working on developing the plan. The plan has targets. They are supposed to present a draft of the plan to the governor by September and have the plan finalized by December 31st of this year. Just recently, it was announced the formation of a climate justice brain trust. They brought together some folks from the academy, not industry, but more from the universities, to help incorporate concepts of address communities of environmental justice type communities where they may be adversely impacted by the transition towards a more carbon neutral economy. And so they're participating and working on that program as well. The Office of the Environmental Justice Public Advocate and the Interagency Environmental Justice Response Team work together. The Interagency Environmental Justice Response Team is made up of heads of the various state agencies that touch on environmental justice issues, and they are working to coordinate their activities to make sure that environmental justice is dealt with in a holistic manner, so it's not piecemeal. They're developing environmental justice and equity environmental justice training for state employees, creating pathways for EJ, if I can abbreviate, to be infused into state governance. They have ongoing projects and initiatives, community resiliency planning for the Southwest Detroit area, particularly zip code 48217. Community resiliency is typically viewed as it's a community's ability to handle a big negative impact, say, a major storm or some other catastrophic event happening, so that they have the ability to bounce back. They're working on that from an environmental justice perspective for that Southwest Detroit community. They have a program that's helping environmental justice community schools deal with their indoor air quality. They're assessing HVAC equipment and monitoring indoor air qualities. They've established a program to monitor air quality using mobile PM 2.5 monitors. They drive around, I believe they are in purple vehicles, sampling the air so that they can respond quickly to community complaints or events or incidents that may occur. They've also established some policies with EGLE. They have a non-discrimination policy that they have brought more front and center. They have a public participation policy, and they've developed a limited English proficiency plan. And the way that these may affect some of us as regulated entities, if we're getting air permits, we may find our public comment periods have been lengthened a little bit in order to make sure that the extra effort towards community outreach in areas where English is not the primary language, or there's a significant population percentage that has limited English proficiency, or where due to economics, there's a limited access to electronic notification in that community, that might warrant extending that time period and the agency making additional efforts at reaching out to make sure that the public has been notified of pending agency actions. So those policies are in place and being implemented, and you may very well see those in action. Otherwise, I think a lot of the other work is still foundational. It's happening kind of below the surface within the agency, developing plans and strategies. And I think in the years to come, we'll start to see the fruit of those as they become more mature. Moving on, the other things that are happening in Michigan, I think we all know, or we may have heard, that the area or large areas of Michigan have become non-attainment for ozone. It includes all of Berrien County in the southwest corner of the state, and parts of Allegan County and Muskegon County along the western shore, and the entire southeast metropolitan area: Monroe, Washtenaw, Wayne, Livingston, Oakland, Macomb, and St. Clair counties. Based on, let's go back here for a second, based on air monitoring data and a change in the standard, those areas are no longer meeting the National Ambient Air Quality Standard for ozone. And what's happening along those lines, again, there's a lot of rulemaking development happening, things that we will see. Berrien County, for instance, based on its monitoring data, it requires a 3-year data set to demonstrate that they are now meeting the standard. So based on 2017, 18, and 19 data, Berrien County showed that they were now at that point meeting the air quality standard. And so the state developed a request to redesignate that area in attainment. It was submitted just last month. And then just after that, the 2020 data came mature and showed that they were back out of attainment based on 2020 data. So that request for redesignation will go nowhere. EPA is essentially just going to sit on it because they are aware that the new data shows they're not in attainment. For all areas, attainment has a target date of being met by this August. Otherwise, the area will bump up from marginal non-attainment, meaning just over the threshold, to a moderate non-attainment area. And the next slide, I'll talk about what that actually means. That the area can get a 1-year extension on when the bump up will occur based on contribution from international sources of emissions or exceptional events. The state is evaluating and investigating exceptional events, things such as wildfires that may have contributed to the days on which high concentrations were measured. And again, international contribution, that's more of an issue in Southeast Michigan, where some of the high ozone days were days when the wind was out of the east, and there might have been an Ontario, Canada contribution. There is data out there that shows that Ontario does contribute at least a couple of ppb towards Michigan's air quality. The standard is 70 ppb, and Michigan, I've got data on the numbers in a couple of slides. Southeast Michigan is over the standard by anywhere from 4 to 6 ppb. So a few ppb could make a difference. So Michigan is evaluating and exploring those opportunities to potentially delay that bump up. But even while they're doing that, they are making preparations for the bump up because the rulemaking deadlines don't change. So what happens if we bump up to moderate? There will be new regulations required statewide VOC and NOx RACT for major sources of those pollutants, and CTG sources. CTG sources does include synthetic organic chemical manufacturing industry, the SOCME industry. CTG is a EPA term. It stands for Controlled Technology Guidelines. It basically EPA lays out, these are the common and understood methods for controlling and the standards to which each type of source for a source category the levels of emission reductions they can achieve. So it will require an update of Michigan's existing VOC and NOx RACT rules. Where there is a source category or a standard already established, those numbers will be updated and made a little more stringent. Where there are no standards established, some facilities will be required to do a case-by-case determination of what is the appropriate level of control or emissions reduction. There are work groups looking at developing those regulations. There's a work group looking at natural gas and refined product pipeline emissions. And there's a work group looking at intermodal transportation events. They're going to look at shipping and railroad and heavy duty trucks and emissions from those as contributors to local sources of ozone precursor emissions. As a moderate non-attainment area, there will be statewide 15% VOC or 15% VOC NOx decrease over a 6-year period required. That's a state obligation they'll have to meet to demonstrate to EPA. It will mean that will kind of be the goal of what the rules above are designed to achieve. They will have to make an attainment demonstration by August 2024. It will require the implementation of a basic vehicle inspection maintenance program for large population areas, which are over 200,000 population, which would be Southeast Michigan only. So those of us who live in Southeast Michigan can look forward to an I&M program that we don't currently have to deal with. For major source permitting in a non-attainment area, it also will increase the offset ratio. If you're building a new major source or making a major modification in a non-attainment area, you currently have to achieve as a marginal non-attainment area. For every ton of pollution you increase, you have to achieve a reduction of 1.1. As a moderate non-attainment area, that ratio goes up to 1.5. So if you were going to make, say, 100 ton per year increase in emissions, you'd have to find 150 tons of offsets so that there will be a net reduction of emissions in the area to allow for you to make that increase. So the monitoring data that I mentioned, this is the most recent monitoring data from DEQ. In Southeast Michigan, this is the 2018-2019. They have 4 monitors, and attainment is determined based on the 4th high. You can see that the 4th high row is bolded out, and the 3-year design value down below is the average of those 3. When you average in this making these demonstrations, you truncate, you don't round. So 71.9 is still 71. And that's so right now you can see the Southeast Michigan area is just a couple ppb over 71, 71, 72, and 71. So again, if there is, they can demonstrate that there's a couple, 2, 3 ppb contribution from international sources, that would take all of those down below 70 and could potentially help demonstrate or get that 1-year extension before the area bumps up to moderate non-attainment. I added to the DEQ's table, the bottom row. These are the highest measured concentration, the highest measured fourth high concentrations that can be observed in 2021 that would cause that monitor to start to show attainment, to show less than 70. So if the fourth high at the East 7 Mile monitor stays below 74, then the average of 2019, 2020, and 2021 would come down to 70. And the same for New Haven, Oak Park, and Port Huron. Those are the values. Based on the values we've seen above, it may be possible, but it's going to be dependent on a number of factors, including how warm or hot a summer we have. In West Michigan, those values are lower, which means that 2021 has to be even a better year than in Southeast Michigan for those areas to achieve attainment. Given that most of those areas are border counties or lakefront, they are effectively viewed as transport issues where air quality is being transported to those areas from the West, which would be Milwaukee and Chicago. Not that we want to point fingers at anybody, but it's their fault. And they are also dealing with their own issues and having to address a number of things at a more severe level than what Michigan is having to deal with. But that record keeping, that is the issue with non-attainment. These rulemaking programs are in process. I think the VOC and NOx RAC regulations are due to be finalized in 2023. You can check the websites, the Air Quality Division's websites, if you are interested in participating in those work groups in any way. They always welcome stakeholder involvement. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
Great, thanks, Steve. John gave me a warm introduction. I think I've hit all the highlights there. I am Mike Grimsberg with Trinity, based in Maryland, so just outside the DC Beltway. I've had an interesting experience on the Maryland Climate Change Commission, which is not really a subject for today, but it's been an education for sure in terms of what Maryland would like to do. So next slide, Steve. So I've tried in my presentation today to keep this real time. There's obviously quite a bit of information being bantered around, and speculation and policy and all the things that DC's good for with a presidential administration change. But I thought this particular quote encapsulated more firmly in the Biden EPA, and it was an EPA spokesperson response based on the recent Ozone NAAQS lawsuit. So from 2 weeks ago, which and I bolded in here the words I think we'll be hearing frequently, and you'll see in this presentation as I go through it here today, is climate crisis, environmental justice, restoring science. I think this particular phrase you'll see ad nauseum as EPA sets its direction and starts sailing here in 2021. Next slide, Steve. In terms of, as I go through the various arcs of how the administration may change what we're going to see in terms of environmental policy and regulation, I thought the Washington Post actually did a fabulous job. If you haven't seen their webpage on this, you might be curious to watch their tracker. But I think what I try to tell people that particularly haven't been through a massive presidential change in terms of what works and how fast things can actually be implemented. The Washington Post kind of put it into 4 buckets, which I think are actually very good. And those 4 buckets, as you can see on my slide, are new, where effectively the policy can simply be put in place by President Biden, typically through an executive order. There's a bucket of easy to overturn things, which would be reversing the position on the Paris Climate Agreement, certain memos, including NSR guidance, and to actually implement the repeal of the Clean Power Plan. So those are things that can pretty easily and timely be done, be implemented by the Biden administration. And then you get into the things that simply take more work. And you get into things where the rule is finished, take the once and always in, or the cost benefit rule, and the ability to rewrite the regulation or implement a court ruling starts getting far more extensive, typically because it involves comment and notice periods. And then kind of the last bucket is just the ones that are very difficult, things that have been fully gone through the notice and comment cycle under the Trump EPA and have probably started their journey on litigation, but it would take a significant court action, act of Congress, or some other process to change those particular positions. Next slide, Steve. So I've described this as the environmental pendulum swing. I'm sure most of you have read these headlines, and I've got some sub bullets here, including an update from yesterday as these things happen in real time. First, there's a regulatory freeze. So as many of you probably tracked, if things didn't make the January 20th Federal Register, they may not happen. And certainly the Biden administration has put a 60-day hold on anything new upon assuming the president's position on Inauguration Day. The DOJ requested global abeyance of all EPA rule litigation. Even though EPA has put rules in abeyance, it doesn't mean that they won't defend what's out there, but they'll selectively figure out what positions the Biden administration would like to take on various rules. It also goes on to point out that yesterday there was a court that decided not to grant the 60-day abeyance to Biden in terms of the NEPA rollback case in Virginia. So that judge decided it was in the best interest of the parties to move ahead and not take DOJ up on that 60-day abeyance. The third bullet on this slide talks about OIRA, which is the Office of Information Regulatory Affairs. When you take a look at this executive order or memo in terms of various agencies that kind of move the needle behind the scenes, OIRA historically has been an office that has tended to be an industry advocate in terms of cost benefit analysis of rules and various other things that maybe the engineer says are common sense. But the Biden administration would like OIRA to start weighing in on more things that are what I would call subjective: equity issues, environmental justice, social justice. And at some level, this gives OIRA a different lens to look through various future rulemaking. So just a note that you may hear some new policy out of this particular office. And then at the bottom there is really just the science-based integrity policy making. Clearly there was a rather large battle in the Trump EPA about what science should be considered, particularly in setting national ambient air quality standards. Obviously, the Biden administration would like to go back to looking at all science of any kind that's credible in those rulemakings. Next slide, Steve. So what's the scope of things being reconsidered? Obviously, as we mentioned earlier, executive orders themselves can't undo things that require notice and comment rulemakings. So it doesn't prevent an executive order from having the department take a look at virtually any area of policy. It's just that implementing a change, if they wanted to do that, still may require a heavy lift by the agency to change the rule. And you can see that under a number of the Trump midnight EPA rules that were signed. Those were multi-year efforts under President Trump before they actually made it to the finish line. Perhaps you've seen there was a memo from the Biden transition team that called out 100 recently finalized rules that they intended to revisit closely. Among that list, 48 of those were environmentally related, including the various National Ambient Air Quality Standards, the once and always rule, the light duty vehicle GHG rule, HFCs, and more than that, there's other non-air things too that may or may not be near and dear to your heart. But beyond the rules, there were other things that people have at least speculated on might also be up for a hard look, whether that's the Casper update proposed rule, which tends to affect more of the eastern US and bigger sources, the Maui guidance in terms of what a permittable discharge to groundwater is or isn't, multi-sectoral general permit, and even the series of RTR litigation processes that are currently ongoing. Next slide, Steve. In terms of who's going to move the ball in this administration and what that looks like, this is a list that I believe is pretty current. It's possible there's been some names changed, but I think when you look at this list, you're going to see a lot of familiar names that come out of the Obama EPA. So, you know, when I'm asked or when I think about where we're headed in terms of policy enforcement rulemaking, excuse me, it really is no secret that it's going to look a lot more like Obama than what we saw with the Trump EPA. I think the takeaway here, though, is unlike when Trump came in and Administrator Pruitt was appointed, there was a lot less, you know, inside DC infrastructure in the administration, which didn't help the Trump EPA get traction in the agencies at a level to move the needle pretty quickly. So I think that the point here will be, it'll be interesting to see whether or not when you've got Janet McCabe and Gina McCarthy, people that are veterans of EPA, whether they'll get much quicker traction in terms of actually delivering on some of these policy commitments. Next slide. Probably can't, you know, say this enough in terms of what will be new in terms of where Biden was versus Trump, but climate and environmental justice seem to be quite aspirational. They may be novel in the sense that the regulated community hasn't broadly had to deal with these. So as you know, the Paris Climate Agreement was, we were officially rejoined either earlier this week or late last week. I think we're going to see quite a bit of rollout on their Big Earth Day, April 2022 goals. So in terms of US climate commitments with specificity, I'd expect a fair amount of rollout in April or by April. In terms of hard commitments, it's going to be interesting where President Biden lands on the nationally determined contribution front. The 2015 commitment was a 26 to 28% reduction by 2025. So the question becomes, will there be a larger commitment if it really is a crisis, and, you know, according to the president? And what parts of the economy get a hard look? So I think those are things to stay tuned for. And then on a different direction is environmental justice. And it certainly sounds like Michigan is taking environmental justice pretty seriously already. But from a national standpoint, it's going to be interesting to see how that rolls out to regulated entities. In particular, you know, I can see that certainly affecting various permitting processes that regulated sources have to go through. Next slide, Steve. So how might EPA tackle climate change and environmental justice? The real question to me will be, what sectors do they go after? We'll have to watch. Obviously, the electric utilities have already been touched with carbon regulation, although there's certainly a big gap between the ACE rule and the Clean Power Plan and what they do next. Autos are certainly part of the climate story in terms of what's been regulated. Oil and gas as well. The question will be, what's next? Will there be, energy intensive industry sectors? Will agriculture be touched? But it's hard to see that this exposure isn't rather broad, depending upon how large a mandate President Biden gives the agency in terms of addressing climate. In terms of various regulatory approaches, Section 111, the NSPS program is certainly a proven approach. There's been at least some articles and thought put into using a section of the Clean Air Act that hasn't been used for this purpose before, which is Section 115 on international transport, in terms of it being a global pollutant. So there's at least some regulatory wonks looking at that as a potential angle for CO2 regulation. The NSR permitting program, will there be additions to that in addition to the GHG backed requirements we currently have? Will we get back into the co-benefit discussion when it comes to rulemaking, where perhaps we pull in GHG reductions by controlling criteria pollutants? In terms of EJ, there's certainly, we've got an administrator that's making their way through Senate approval. He comes from a state where environmental justice has been near and dear to his heart. So there are screening tools. There's certainly permitting enforcement and other mechanisms on EJ that I think we're all going to need to keep a close eye on. Next slide. This is the area which I'm somewhat most interested in terms of policy statements from the agency, in terms of what they are going to do on the enforcement side. Clearly, the trend of inspection rates by EPA is down, and it was down dramatically during Trump. I think it's hard to imagine that the downward trend continues, given the Biden administration's view on the environment. So I think as a regulated entity, I would start just rethinking that the enforcement tone and perhaps the cooperative federalism policy and governmental principles start fading, whether or not we'll start seeing a ramp up in enforcement. In terms of the one area that we've seen some movement on under Biden is the reinstatement of possible uses for supplemental environmental projects. So projects where in an enforcement action, a source agrees to undertake some improvements. In that regard, there was a February 4th DOJ letter that reinstated it after Trump's prohibition. I will say that a Trinity person that was involved in an enforcement case here in the last 2 weeks has heard from DOJ attorneys that even though that letter's out there kind of touting wide open use of SCPs and enforcement, the guidance they received was that in practice, it's still a very narrow, limited use of SCPs as far as DOJ is concerned today. Next slide. So one thing to look at, and I'm sure John, who's been in DC, has observed this, particularly when you get an administration change. What happened in Congress the prior year can really matter to what we see in the upcoming year. And the next couple slides talk about EJ bills. The second bullet seems to be the one that I keep hearing has the most potential legs, which is the Clean Economy, Jobs, and Innovation Act. HR 4447, which passed the House last September. And it has a number of provisions in a bill that Vice President Harris sponsored in the Senate. And I've got a slide that kind of outlines in detail what those components are. But needless to say, with a democratically controlled House and Senate, there's going to be kind of relatively easy to pick up bills that have legs, that have been vetted by one or both houses at some level to pass new laws on environmental justice. So this is certainly an area that you should circle as potentially active on the Hill. Next slide, Steve. Apologize for the small print, but as I looked at this slide several times and I violated my rule of 25 words, which I think we all throw out the window with COVID, but this is a pretty daunting list of potential elements in this act. Additional NEPA public involvement, cumulative public health risk assessment. So instead of being focused and permitting on just your impacts, looking at impacts of yourself and surrounding entities and risks. A number of low income related assessments in terms of access to information and public participation. There's a provision to amend the Civil Rights Act to allow legal remedies for under discriminatory practices, and on and on. I mean, the list here, frankly, is quite thorough in terms of scope, and if it were passed, there would be quite a bit of activity in terms of how EPA would, most likely EPA would need to implement this. Next slide, Steve. All right, I think this is my last slide. It's the Congressional Review Act, which was passed in 1996 and allows Congress to overturn final agency actions. It requires an expedited congressional process. A simple majority is required. Both houses, bicameral actions necessary, and the president has to agree. I've heard that any regulation that was passed more or less after August 21st of last year is potentially eligible to this. If a final rule was passed before that date, then it's time barred effectively from CRA actions. It's very limitedly used since 1996. It was used once in 2001 and 14 times in 2017. But there's some interesting caveats in it. So, and again, I should note that the historical use was all regulations, not just environmental. But the one hang up that creates a little bit of angst and strategy is that if a particular rule is subjected to repeal under the CRA, the agency is prevented from working on a substantially similar regulation to the rule being vacated. So in the case of, they want to overturn effectively, say an ozone NAC standard, their ability to pick it immediately up and repropose another NACs, which probably is not a great example, is limited because it's gone through the CRA process. I was on a particular call where someone asked, what does substantially similar mean? And that's one of those phraseologies that apparently has yet to be tested in court. So other than grabbing Webster's dictionary and reading those words, if it's ever challenged, it will be interesting to see what substantially similar may or may not mean. So the two targets that that have come up, at least in some of the meetings and dialogue I've been involved in, is one is this GHG significant contribution finding rule for electric utilities and the science transparency rule. So it'll be interesting to see whether Congress can fit anything more on its plate, the next month or two or three, and how the environmentalists and President Biden and Congress decide to use the CRA might be some interesting strategy. So with that, Steve, I think that's my last slide. I think we can open it up for questions.
Great, thank you, Steve and Mike. Appreciate the presentation there. And again, we will make the slides available and the handouts for attendees. We'll also have the recording of this webinar posted within the next few days. So I do see there's one comment in the chat about the non-attainment offset ratio under moderate non-attainment. So I don't know if you want to review that or respond, but what would happen in that case? And I guess, go ahead, Steve.
I was saying, yeah, I can go back over that unless there's a specific question. The non-attainment offset ratio applies when a facility in a non-attainment area is proposing an existing major source is proposing a major modification, or a new major source is wanting to locate in a non-attainment area. One of the features they have to meet for permitting is they have to obtain offsets to offset the increase in emissions that is generated by that major modification or by that major new source. And the offset has to be, at present, 1.1 tons for every ton of an increase. Under a moderate non-attainment area, which would get triggered theoretically beginning later this year, the ratio would change to 1.5 tons to every ton of increase. And so that's how that works. First, you have to be an existing major source that makes a major modification, or you have to be locating a new major source into a non-attainment area.
Okay. The comment in the chat, it says the moderate non-attainment has a 1.15 to 1 offset ratio, not 1.5 to 1.
Oh.
But we can maybe clarify that. And
we can clarify that. Yeah, they might be right.
We'll clarify that and make the update if necessary on the slides or handouts when we distribute those. So,
okay.
I do want to ask specifically on the ozone one. What would companies expect to see besides offsets? Potentially vehicle inspection and maintenance, and what other things might be coming to Southeast Michigan in particular, or Michigan in general, that we haven't seen in a while on ozone permitting and compliance?
Well, certainly the I&M program, but we're going to see what currently doesn't get a whole lot of attention in permitting or in air regulatory issues much anymore are the Part 6 rules. That's where Michigan has its current RACT requirements for VOCs. They're circa early 90s, and most facilities have gone way beyond that. The technology has just advanced. A lot of that are coding rules where they're required so many pounds of VOC per gallon of coating. And with the maturity of the water-based coating industry, those numbers are now met on a regular basis. But under revised RACT rules, what's in the Part 6 rules will get ratcheted down. And so companies may find themselves having to work to achieve those numbers once those new rules come into being. The other thing would be NOx RACT, where the numbers for burning, even burning, what natural gas like a clean, which is considered a clean fuel, those numbers may get ratcheted down. So, stay tuned and see what happens or what's going to develop with those rules. Those are the kinds of things that most everybody will see. The kind of things that apply to major sources, those will tend to be few and far between, because what generally happens is that companies are so interested in avoiding becoming subject to those rules that they make voluntary emission reductions so that they don't trigger those rules. So the 1.15 or 1.5 tons per ton offset will never apply, because the company will make their own reduction so that they fall below the major modification threshold.
Great, thank you. Certainly, you want to be in touch with your consultants and your own engineers about looking at those sorts of issues. It does seem probably likely that we'll be facing those here in the state.
Yeah, John, if I can, I just want to add the other piece of that. If you are subject to that program, it's not just the offsets, but your project will be subject to an emissions reductions threshold referred to as the lowest achievable emission rate, which is defined as if anybody in the country has met a limit, then you have to meet that limit or beat that limit. So that becomes a research program to see what is the most stringent limit that any similar facility is meeting. And that becomes the limit that you will have to meet. And there is no cost threshold on that, effectively no cost threshold on that. So you, by becoming subject to that requirement, you could be signing up for some very, very stringent controls and costly controls. So again, most companies facing that situation will voluntarily control to a lesser degree to get out of that program rather than becoming subject to that program.
Thanks for that, Steve. Got a question for Mike about the Biden administration. What advice would you give regulated sources on which of these issues they really should be tracking during the first few months that would actually impact their operations? Some of this stuff is a little bit abstract at this point, but what's going to be the more tangible near-term changes that are really got to be looking at?
Well, I think, John, in terms of what I would be looking at if I was a regulated entity, clearly any discussion on the climate policy direction that they roll out between now and April, I would make a very important note on, just because of how aggressive, whether you're going to be a focus sector, and knowing that those are complicated matters and not very simple to resolve. So I think that's one area that I'd immediately circle, because that's certainly ambitious of the administration. The other is and again, it sounds like Michigan's got its own EJ program, but I think from the standpoint of knowing that all of your permits that typically go out for public comment may now have a rather subjective environmental justice review becomes pivotal in terms of just being prepared for that. And in a sidebar, John, you mentioned you lived before the call outside of DC. Virginia operates an environmental justice program, and Fairfax County, Virginia is probably one of the 10 wealthiest counties in the nation. But in Virginia's EJ program, even in Fairfax County, the way they've designed it, you can have an economically disadvantaged household that may have an annual taxable income of $250,000. So it can be weirdly. So I think that's just another area to watch. Yeah,
great. And I guess one follow-up question I would have on the EJ thing. Do you think that Congress or the Michigan legislature would have to pass legislation, I think like the state of New Jersey did, to require something like a cumulative impact assessment? Or do you think there's some leeway for EPA or EGLE to implement something substantially similar to that, using executive authority only?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not a Michigan state law expert. I think federally, when they would put through an act, something that we've talked about that would enable it, but I have seen in other states here in the Southeast US where perhaps for the utility sector, I've seen the Public Service Commission decide to enter that world and kind of force the issue. So I'd have to maybe defer to someone that knows Michigan law better, but I do think federally, between strong arm EPA policy and perhaps a new law they'll be able to enable that.
If I can pipe in on Michigan, Michigan has a pretty robust air toxics program already in place. It does not currently look at cumulative impacts or combined or I want to say symbiotic, but that's not the right word, impacts from various chemical species. But they do have a program that's already in place. I don't think it would take them much by the way of just administrative rulemaking to add that other functionality onto it.
Yeah, certainly. Synergistic, I think, is the term.
That's the word. Yep.
Yeah, when you're talking about different air toxic combinations potentially.
So John, I did see one question posted on transport on ozone. Maybe I'll tackle that real quick here before we run out of time. So I'll predict in terms of where ozone transport goes beyond this Casper update. My sense is it's going to simply be another ratcheting of the ozone standard. And when you look at the Casper proposal that came out, given some of the nuances and how that case was settled in terms of implementable time frame, I would argue that it kind of gave the industrials a pretty easy pass, given that those controls would have to be in place in very short order. So I do think we'll continue to see scope creep on ozone controls to keep the Northeast in compliance.
Yeah, which certainly has some impacts upwind here for Michigan. So, other last questions from folks in the chat or Q&A? All right, well, we will be following up with everybody as promised with the slide materials, and certainly Trinity offers a wealth of resources. They have great newsletters and other content that's regularly providing insights and updates on these kind of issues. Follow them on social media. Find is a great place where I get my information. And we will also be posting the recording. As mentioned, if you missed something, want to go back and review that. So appreciate Steve and Mike, you offering your expertise, and appreciate everyone on the webinar for joining us and giving us your time. And we look forward to seeing you around. We do have upcoming webinars on green chemistry innovations on March 10th. And then we'll be doing a roundtable on community advisory panels for the chemical industry and local outreach later in March. So look forward to seeing you on those programs. Thanks again. Have a great rest of your day.